of the Forest Service's predator eradication efforts. And but then long after, right? So he was born, and by the way, yesterday was his birthday. Aldo Leopold turned 129 yesterday on January 11th. But so he was 23, and that event happened in 1910. He shot that wolf in 1910, and then he wrote that essay somewhere around 1946 or 1945. About 35 years later, he wrote Thinking Like a Mountain, and most of the other material in the Sand County Almanac. The title of that book, by the way, for those of you who are wondering, what kind of bizarre name is that? It's the Sand Counties are the northern and central counties in Wisconsin and some of those other Great Lakes states that were terrible management practices led to the loss of all their topsoil, and now there's just sand. And Aldo bought some property when he was hired, shortly after he was hired at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he was the world's first professor of game management. And then he started evolving quite rapidly from, this was, I think he spent roughly 20 years of his life working for the Forest Service in the Southwest. Right? And then the next 20 years of his life he spent working, and then he died suddenly. But so it's kind of evenly divided between a professor, but subsequently he changed his title, and the name of his whole program, his department, to Wildlife Management, not Game Management. And that all, of course, reflected his thinking and his gradual evolution from being a Pinchoian conservationist to being some kind of ecocentrist. All right. He said in those days we never heard of passing up a chance to kill a wolf because we were Group A conservationists. The basic commodities of wildlife are sport and game meat, and conservation of sport and game meat requires predator eradication. Group B believes, on the other hand, that predators are a vital part of biotic communities and should be protected as a matter of biotic right. All right. So there's our beloved Uncle Aldo. That's in front of his shack. I was going to say, he and his family, shortly after he moved to Wisconsin, they bought this, it's about, 150 acres in one of these sand counties that's all desolate, and they made it the rest of their lives. They would go there on weekends, and they'd spend a lot of time there in the summer and in the spring, trying to restore the area. Planting, they did all of it. In his journals, he's constantly taking notes, counting, making lists of different species of trees, how many there are. And anyway, he planted thousands and thousands. He and his wife and his kids planted thousands and thousands of trees. And that property is still there, by the way, and there's Aldo Leopold, I forget, there's some kind of nonprofit that runs it now. It's a really interesting place to go visit. Then his shack is there too, but it's kind of fenced off and you have to go on a tour to go see it. I didn't go see it. But this was a chicken shack. It was a chicken, that's all it is. It's an old chicken house. It's the only building that was on their land when they bought it. And so whenever they would visit, the first thing they did was they cleaned it out. He says there was like just mud, like up to your knees on the bottom. That's all there was. But they fixed it up and made it into a place where they could stay. And then they would do their little restoration projects as a family. And he also would do his writing, right? He'd sit out front here. He's probably working on one of his essays right here. And there's a famous quote. I was surprised, I get sentimental. But I've read this to my students for so many years, but still, sometimes I just can't help it. I guess it's, when the mother wolf, right, that was a she-wolf, that was the alpha wolf that Uncle Aldo shot that day, shamelessly. No, he was ashamed, but it took him a while to figure it out. But anyway, just the description of how they're playfully greeting each other. And then these men, the first thing they think of is grabbing their guns and just blasting away at them. That's the part that always kind of gets me. But probably if it was just any old wolf, I wouldn't tear up and get sentimental. But when I think about all the connections, right, from what happened after that, and what it taught Leopold, and what he went on to do, and what he went on to become and give us in his writings, it's pretty meaningful. It's worth being sentimental about. All right. So he was a bow hunter, actually. And as far as I know, there are only like 1 or 2 instances of him actually killing a deer. He loved to go bow hunting. His wife was a very good bow hunter, too. And he made his own bows, too. His job, for a while, one of his jobs with the Forest Service was involved protecting, I don't know, he had access to all these exotic woods. So he was able to make these really nice bows and became very good at it. All right. So I don't need to. A famous poem, right? It's in a 17th century poem by John Donne. And perhaps one very simple lesson that Leopold is imparting to us in the land ethic is that we're all connected. And not just us humans, but the land, the water, the air, and the wildlife. So he's clearly influenced by Leopold, by Darwin. Although I did look for the name Darwin in this reading, and it never appears. Leopold never makes reference to Darwin in the land ethic. But obviously in his professional life, he was strongly influenced by Darwin. And all of his other writings, he was pretty well published. He published hundreds of articles in professional journals, but they were all in scientific journals, because he was a scientist, he was an ecologist. He seemed to have had a healthy skepticism with regard to religion, too. His wife was a Catholic, but he himself never went to church. He let her raise the kids in the church, I guess, but he didn't really he wasn't that interested. Anyway. But this is it's kind of a rudimentary theory. In a way, it's not very well developed, but there's something plausible and coherent about it. He says a long time ago, way back in the Bronze Age, and at the time of the 10 Commandments, morality dealt largely with relations between individuals. And then thousands of years passed, and we began to become more aware of individuals' relationships to society. We began to become more aware of the need to all get along as a society, because we're not just in tribes and close relationships with all the people in our lives, right? We have all these other obligations to society. And so a whole bunch of ethics emerged, right? In Judeo-Christian philosophy, the Golden Rule emerged, and then in ancient Greece, they developed all kinds of virtue ethics, right, that dealt with relations among people and relations between people and society. And then utilitarianism and Kant's categorical imperative. These are all examples of second stage of the development, the evolution of morality. And then the third stage, according to Leopold, will deal with humankind's relationship with land, air, water, wildlife. And in a nutshell, it seems like what Leopold anticipates is our scientific knowledge becoming so overwhelming that we will eventually have no choice but to conduct ourselves with regard to natural resources in a way that's more harmonious, or that really is harmonious and sustainable, not only economically sustainable for humans, but sustainable for all life forms. All right. And that would be the land ethic. That would be the full flower of the land ethic, where, it seems to me anyway, where ecological wholes, this is what Leopold envisions, is a society in which not necessarily through government though, all right? And Leopold had also a very skeptical attitude toward government. That biography I mentioned by Kurt Mein, I got a lot of insights into Leopold's attitude toward, he was not a Roosevelt, he was not a New Deal supporter. That was when he was most active professionally, was during a very progressive, where government was very active, government was very involved in promoting conservationism, for example. And Leopold was very skeptical about the idea that people could be coerced by government into having a responsible relationship with the land. And he thought that education really was the key. That people just needed to become educated about ecology and biology and all the relationships that accrue between us and everything else. And once people were aware of that, Leopold thought the land ethic would just naturally emerge, and our institutions would become much more sensitive to land, air, water, wildlife. That really hasn't happened very much. You know, we've had some success, obviously, in wilderness preservation and species preservation, but in terms of the overall health of the planet, we've made very little progress. So this is the other quote that I really like. The extension of ethics to land, air, water, wildlife is an evolutionary possibility and an ecological necessity. This statement reflects Leopold's biosocial account of the origin of ethics. The land ethic is an evolutionary possibility because ethics are a function of community, of the inherently social nature of humankind. So this may be more, Collicutt sneaks in, because when I first started studying this stuff, Collicutt's interpretation of Leopold was the most one that just kind of convinced me, and so I instinctually am more of a Collicutt interpretation of Leopold, but that may be wrong. But Leopold seems to have this theory that the community concept is, the community, what he wants to say that some conception of community is at the heart of all systems of ethics. Some set of kinship obligations that we have among people who aren't even related, to people who aren't even related to us. Not kinship, but obligations, moral obligations. And furthermore, this sense of moral obligations, according to Leopold, can be extended outside of the human community to more than human elements in our community, like land, air, water, wildlife. All right? It's kind of another very exotic claim, really. But the idea is that the concept of community is fluid and adaptable, can be extended via common sense to include land, air, water, wildlife. All right? The extension of ethics to land, air, water, wildlife is an evolutionary possibility and an ecological necessity. All right, and again, this statement also reflects Leopold's consequentialist leanings. Extension of ethics to land, air, water, wildlife is an ecological necessity. Well, duh, obviously, because the consequences of failing to extend ethics in this way will be catastrophic, right? The consequences are just terrible. They're so terrible that, you know, let's be glad that the extension of ethics to land, air, water, wildlife, at least it's an evolutionary possibility. Hey, great, you know, it could be an evolutionary impossibility, in which case we'd be totally stuck, right? But evolution has made it possible for us to actually think and feel this way about non-human beings and systems, right? Ecosystems. And furthermore, if we don't, we're in really deep shit, right? If we don't get our act together and begin regarding ecological wholes as holders of rights, if we don't begin regarding them as such, then we're going to, you know, we're already digging our own, you know, I mean, we've got our, Western culture has one foot in the grave, and the other one's on a banana peel. With regard to our natural resource policies, right? I mean, it's just out of whack. Totally, completely unsustainable. Even that's just a buzzword nowadays, though, you know, I mean, that's another way of saying we better figure it out pretty damn soon. And we are figuring it out. Sometimes our institutions are slow to change. All right, ethics are possibly a kind of community instinct in the making. Think about the tension between morality and freedom, between morality and progress, perhaps. Freedom, I mean progress, we want to encourage people to maximize their powers, to do their liberties, right? And yet ethics does the opposite, right? I mean morality. This is America, right? It's free. Right? And yet, if you suggest that certain things are un-American, and then someone says, well, what do you mean? I thought you said, you know, we're free. It's the land of the free. How come I can't do this? Well, it's un-American because it's just wrong. Right? So there's always a tension between morality and freedom. And so what Leopold is suggesting is that we're reaching a point where morality is putting tight constraints, increasingly tighter constraints on what we are doing to the earth, to land, air, water, wildlife. So, and that's kind of, and we have to grow up. That's another reading, right? Kant, another reading of the Enlightenment. Kant says that enlightenment is freedom from self-imposed immaturity. That's one suggestion when he was asked, how do you define enlightenment? Freedom from self-imposed immaturity. And we need knowledge to do that, right? We need to know how our actions affect natural resources in order to have an enlightened relationship with natural resources, right? So that's what's lacking. We don't, but science is screaming at us, trying to enlighten us, and yet our institutions are lagging far behind. So it's, you know, what's happened is that our technological capacities have far outpaced our moral evolution. And then finally in the 20th century along comes the science of ecology disclosing that, hey, we have all these moral obligations. If only for our own benefit, perhaps. You know, that's one idea. Sure, we have all these moral obligations. If we don't observe these moral obligations, then we're all toast, right? But we might also have a much deeper kind of moral obligations based on the intrinsic value or the independent moral status of things in nature. All right, but according to this one reading of Leopold, ethics are a kind of instinct. Just as instincts, biological instincts, help an animal survive by offering guidance in threatening situations, ethics help a community survive. They're sort of a cultural instinct, if you will. They're not perhaps biological, but a cultural instinct. Survive in the long term by offering guidance in situations so new or intricate or involving such deferred reactions that the path of social expediency is not discernible to the average individual. Right? The salmon makes her way up. What did I do? All by instinct, right? How would she know that that's the only time of year she can make her way up all the way to where she was born, where she wants to lay her eggs? How does she know that? By instincts, right? Well, what Leopold is saying is that our systems of morality offer us these shortcuts to actions which are expedient in the long run, right? Which protect us in the long run. Getting along with people, right, protects us in the long run. Those communities that have strong bonds of strong moral ties tend to outlast those communities that, and that's Darwin's theory of evolution, right? In a nutshell, Darwin says morality evolves in human communities because those human communities that are more cooperative, that have stronger bonds of cooperation, tend to survive over the long run. Whereas those communities of self-centered people tend to die out. So that is why morality, too, according to Darwin. Because a lot of people challenged Darwin and said, well, how can you account for morality without some reference to God? So Darwin thought about it, and then he came up with his theory of the evolution of morality, which Leopold largely accepts. All right. So Leopold says that all ethics rest on the premise that the individual is a member. It's time to take a break. All right? So let's come back at 2 minutes after 1 o'clock. I caught myself. All right. I know we're right in the middle of the stream here, but that's just how it goes. Oh yeah, and you guys can just kind of hand in your, I don't have an attendance sheet for today, but I'll bring one in on Thursday and you guys can sign it. Oh, wait a minute.
You don't think so.
Oh yeah. People were supposed to summarize the Aldo Leopold reading for today. Yeah. Did I email last week? Did I email the syllabus to you? No, so you didn't even know. Just don't worry about it then. Just try to get caught up. You also have a summary due next Tuesday too. All right, so try to get them both in by next Tuesday. Sure. And just put you in here, so just put you down here. Yeah. Some of them might not be hyperlinks. Some of the times you have to copy them and paste them into your browser. Yeah, they're all in there. All the readings are, most of them are from the internet. Some of them are from the library database. Yeah, of course. Yeah, send me a reminder. Okay. Yeah.
Closest relative to the Tasmanian tiger. They don't seem very cat-like.
Yeah, some other marsupial, I guess. You know, maybe the Tasmanian devil. Tasmanian devils are kind of more analogous to a raccoon, I think.
Yeah.
But they're more ferocious than a raccoon. So I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know what's related to them. There's all these very odd habits among those animals down there. The monotremes, the duck-billed platypus, and two others. There are only 3 species in this whole family or something, anyway, monotremes. But they lay eggs, and then when their eggs hatch out, then they nurse their babies. And their platypuses actually have a poisonous stinger on their heel. Isn't that a trip? They're vicious little guys. It's not a deadly poison, I guess, but it's probably a lot worse than a bee sting, though. It's more like a scorpion.
Do they actively use it, or I thought it was just to keep away predators from chasing after them?
I assume, yeah. I mean, they can stab people with it.
What do you think of the developments at the wildlife refuge?
Well, philosophically and historically, it seems as though the people who took over that wildlife refuge, they seem kind of ignorant about, for example, the history of ownership of that land. You know, they want to talk about returning, but that Mulier Wildlife Refuge was carved out of what used to be a reservation that got terminated. And of course, all that land, you know, is Native American. Of course, everything. This is too, right here. But there's a much stronger claim. Indigenous, you know, the Paiutes have a much stronger claim to that land than any rancher. So you know, it's a little bit disheartening to see the government openly defied. Perhaps, I don't know, am I some kind of a law and order Republican? Because I'm a little bit offended by the idea that people can just go jump on a piece of government property, turn on this big machine and go tear out a fence, which is their latest thing, you know. And they're driving around in government vehicles.
They're also logging into computers
and they're using their computers too.
Looking up, like, you know, government research in order to find fault with. It's really an attack on science.
It is an attack on science. Yeah. The counter. I mean, just the post-Enlightenment developments in our society are really kind of terrifying. People seem to be openly embracing a return to the Dark Ages and just a total rejection of Enlightenment thinking. You know, when Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring, in I think 1962, within 2 years, both the White House and Congress had taken steps, dramatic, decisive steps, to prohibit the use of DDT, except in very unusual circumstances. Within 2 years, right? That's an Enlightenment society at work, right? When the government listens to its scientists and then makes policy changes. But now we've known about anthropogenic climate disintegration and global ecocide for what? How long have we known about these things? And yet they keep going on. And then we get these crazy people spouting off just nonsense. Anyway, and they reject evolution, and we just go back to some kind of primitive state of ignorance. Anyway, so all ethics rest on the premise that the individual is, let's see, okay, yeah, this is an important slide. Instincts and selfishness cause the individual to compete with other individuals for greater wealth and a privileged place in the community. And that's good, right? And that encourages progress. Ethics and altruism, on the other hand, cause the individual to cooperate with other individuals. And that kind of puts a restraint on progress, perhaps. Or certainly puts a restraint on freedom. The land ethic enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. Leopold suggests that every member of our community has a right to continued existence. So, land, air, water, wildlife, in virtue of what we know, what we have learned from biology and ecology, are illuminated from within now as rights holders. Right? That seems to be what he's suggesting. And that's now they had no, well, so this is interesting. You know, where did this come from? Where did this new metaphysical, is it a new metaphysical status? I guess they had it all the time, right? I mean, did those slave girls that Odysseus hanged, did they not have moral status because they had no legal status? Is that what happened? Where nowadays that's unthinkable, right? You can't just go hanging people because they made some mistake in serving the tea or whatever, right? Because, so how does this metaphysical transformation take place? Presumably when it takes place with humans, when the subject being transformed culturally into a rights holder from a possession, from a property, from a thing, to a rights holder. When that entity who is undergoing that transformation is human, we presumably want to say that, well, society was messed up. It had made a lot of mistakes, you know, and it didn't recognize the truth. But the truth is that all along, those slave girls had rights. And all along, African Americans had rights. And all along, right, women had rights. All along, right? It's just that we didn't recognize them. So they had that metaphysical status all along, right? So now we have to ask, if we're going to talk about rights holders that are non-human, an ecological whole as a rights holder, if we're going to talk about that, then we have to ask again, well, how does this metaphysical transformation take place? Leopold seems to be arguing that when a human community evolves to the point where it adopts the land ethic, at that point, the boundaries of the community expand to include soils, waters, atmosphere, plants, animals, species, earth, etc. And soils, waters, the atmosphere, etc., then come to be recognized as holders of rights to continued existence. Okay, notice how I put it, come to be recognized. Do they come to have? And what are we doing exactly? Are we treating them as though they have rights, or do they actually have rights? How could this remarkable metaphysical transformation occur? Do soils, waters, the atmosphere, plants, etc., mysteriously acquire rights when the human community adopts the land ethic? That's kind of a head scratcher, isn't it? How could that be? Just because humans started thinking differently, now all of a sudden these entities have a different metaphysical status? Wait a minute now. How can that be? It seems like you'd want, if they have that metaphysical status, it seems like it's not based on humans. It's not based on humans thinking it, right? It's not based on human enlightenment. It's just there. And that would be Holmes Rolston's. But we have a ways to go before we get to his outlook. So, the community, one theory, would be Collicutt's theory, is that what happens is when the community recognizes through the emerging sciences of ecology and biology the interconnections between the human community and the non-human community, then at that point essential elements like ecological wholes have rights conferred upon them. But they didn't have those rights. They don't have those rights autonomously. It requires human culture to activate those rights. And that perhaps is the best interpretation of what Leopold is arguing too. You know, he's saying that, hey, we've reached a point where we're so aware now that we just have no choice but to think of these ecological wholes as having rights. All right, but it is odd, you know, again, you're moving from an observation about ecological wholes to a normative claim that we have duties, we have obligations, right? And that's a very strong claim, and it is a bit mysterious as to where those obligations are based. You know, what are they based on exactly? All right, so the last possibility here is that they had rights all along. All these things up here, the soils, the land, the air, the water, they had rights all along. But the human community was too stupid. We were unevolved. And now we're evolved, so now we have to recognize that what they had all along. All right. So this is all real basic stuff. But I'm going over it fairly carefully because this is the beginning. This is the dawn of efforts to articulate a true environment, a real environmental ethic, something more than just an ethic of, just something more than just long-sighted humanism or long-sighted conservationism, right? Okay, and that's an ethic too, right? And of course, there are very strong, very persuasive ethics that just say, you know, I mean, the moral claim that we ought to protect our atmosphere for the sake of future. For the sake of our own generation. But that would not be an environmental ethic, perhaps, right? It's one way of getting at the difference. But so Leopold is the first guy, evidently, that is trying to articulate an ecocentric point of view. And he doesn't quite pull it off, but at least he hints at it, and later on we'll figure out whether or not we can do more than just hint at it. But that's the more difficult work that we're waiting to do later in the term, after we do our midterm. All right. So conservation, he's very critical of the way conservation is actually carried out